No one is talking about this paint range, so why am I reviewing it? These are Mr. Pigment's new acrylic paints. You may know Mr. Pigment from a YouTube channel, or if you're like me, I actually found him through a Discord channel. It's probably apparent by now that there's no real branding behind this paint range. There's no marketing campaign or influencers talking about it. But when I came across these two sets, the primary mixing set and the auxiliary and rare pigment set, I really felt compelled to try them. So I ordered some, and I'm really excited to talk about them. From what I can tell, Mr. Pigment, or you can call him Dress, is a guy with a lot of experience in paint formulation and pigments. This paint set was homemade, and it's taken at least 3 years for everything to come together to what you see now. And I think that's no small feat. And they're not cheaply made. Dress really wanted to make a premium product, and I'm really all about that. My favorite scientific method is to experiment, and in this case, I made sure to open every single paint bottle on a wet palette, and then I swatched them on a random 3D print. Just wanted to get a feel for what I was working with. The titanium white is probably the whitest white I've ever seen in real life. Compared to Vallejo's white, which is actually a quite good one, you can see that there's a big difference in that the Vallejo one is a bit warmer. When swatching these two paints, however, to the naked eye, they pretty much look very similar. Although Mr. Pigment's white is a little bit more transparent. Bismuth yellow is also very transparent and super vibrant. I compared it to Pro Acryl's Bismuth yellow. They're pretty much indistinguishable. But I'm not going to be talking through every single paint because the more I swatched them, the more I saw a couple common themes. Transparency is one of them. Given that the pigments used have very fine particles, which means more light will pass through them, this means that, it's gonna be very hard for these paints to be opaque. This is not necessarily a bad thing. You can use transparency to your own benefit, but you just need to be aware that it's there. So it did get me thinking, if you look at these two blues, for example, the opaque one being from Pro Acryl and the other one being from Mr. Pigment, what makes one more transparent than the other? Is it that Pro Acryl is using white as a base, for example? How can you control the pigment to be more opaque without sacrificing the vibrancy? These are really difficult questions to answer, and that's why paint formulation can be so hard. Obviously, because opacity and vibrancy are kind of at odds with each other. Now back to these paints, they're absolutely beautiful. I was having a really great time discovering each one, but then I started noticing something else happening. Brush strokes. The brush strokes were visible. From what I could tell, the pigments were depositing on the sides of the brushstroke and at the very end, which usually happens anyway, but in this case it was just a little bit too noticeable. I figured out a slightly damp brush would be better as opposed to a fully wet brush, and that was going to give me the better control without making the paint too wet, but still, I just wasn't getting it quite right. By this time, I just wanted to paint something, so this is Ygritte, the Giantess, by Dungeons and Lasers. I primed her with a blue spray because I'm just kind of sick of black primers. I chose Burnt Sienna as the main paint for the skin on this one. I knew I'd have to work with thin layers to get a nice base coat, but unsurprisingly, the brush strokes were still very much there. I added a bit of thinner and glaze medium, which helped with the brushstroke situation, but thinning this type of paint even further was actually not going to do me any favors. After some research, I came across this gel medium that helps thicken acrylic paints. I took some time to figure out the best ratio, and again, I tried to use a bit of glaze medium to get the best of both worlds. At the end of the day, the gel medium was starting to create some unwanted textures. Obviously, because it's thickening the paint so much, the more you put it on the Mini, the more you're going to start to notice that it's actually adding volume to the Mini, which is something you don't really want. So after this, I just took the day off and tried to figure out my next steps. Another possible solution for thickening paint is using Carboxymethyl cellulose. I hope I'm saying that right. Commonly used as a baking agent. So yes, there is a risk that your paint job will go bad because you are using a food-grade material. Anything that can breed bacteria is pretty much a no-go. But I do feel like if you add a varnish at the end, that's possibly going to keep things together a little bit better. Also, a heads up that the powder literally flies everywhere, so just be careful when you're handling it over your things. I'm not gonna lie, the first attempts were very messy, and I just felt like I was adding flour to the paint, and mixing it all together on a dry palette was definitely not the best idea. I added less and less with each attempt, and that did seem to make things a little bit better. Obviously, when you're just working with a few drops of paint, you're not going to need that much product. I'm no expert here, but I do think this powder solution is definitely better than the gel medium, especially if you can mix it properly, not like how I was doing it. We're not going to get a gooey consistency, which is a bonus. Over the next hour or so, I went a bit rogue with it all. I tried the powder and the gel, I added thinner, glazed medium, all of it in different measurements just to see what worked. And I was really stubborn with it, and I really did try my best to get results. Eventually, I did start to realize another thing was going wrong. And I don't know if it's because I added the gel or I added the medium, but I was getting some reactivation from these paints if they were painted on other types of paints or other branded paints, right? That is, if I base coat it with an opaque acrylic paint and then use these paints on top, the layer underneath it, reactivate it. And for me, this is actually a big problem. I do think hobbyists will use different paint ranges while working on the same project. I think that's quite common. So having this reactivation happening is really, really not great. However, if you've tried these paints before, just let me know if it's happened to you or if maybe I'm doing something wrong. I mean, I'm happy to take responsibility. I'm just trying these paints from a beginner perspective, and I do hope that that can be taken into consideration. Unfortunately, I did struggle to use these paints like I wanted to. To summarize, my issues were mainly about the consistency of the paint, which initially feels quite good right out of the bottle. But once you actually start painting with it and seeing the brush strokes and then dealing with the transparency, it just becomes a little too messy. And finally, the reactivation, like I mentioned before, was also not ideal. But I do assume that it's something that can be fixed with an upcoming batch, for example. I know that there's been other brands that have had this issue and then they kind of fixed it, so there must be a way to get around it. I do not want to be negative though, like I do want to say that I did have a lot of fun using these paints, and I think the purpose of my video really is to give some feedback, give some suggestions, and just as a person that really wants to use, high quality pigmented paints, I really want to see Mr. Pigment / Dress thrive and just, do better. So I do have a few questions and also a few suggestions, so I hope you can hear me out. Number one, I understand that the quality of the pigments is quite important in your list, and the single pigment paints, rare pigments, are kind of a huge selling point of this range. But for me, the usability is not there yet. I'm a hobbyist simpleton. I want things to be easy, and I know that might sound a little bit stupid. Why can't I just work harder? But at the end of the day, if you want to sell your products, you do need to make it a little bit easier for people to be able to work with it. So my question is, would you be willing to sacrifice the purity of the paint and the pigments for the usability of them? So adding a few extra things so that they are, a little more thick with a different type of consistency. The main issue is really not the transparency. I think that can be worked with. I think if you can work on the flow of the pigments so that they don't overflow to the sides of the brush, or, at the very end as you're doing a brush stroke, I think that would improve things massively. Second thing I wanted to mention is actually marketing. So Dress, I know you're an arts guy and you're also a science guy, which is amazing. Marketing and branding is probably not at the top of your mind, but what are you actually trying to sell here? Who is your target audience? What is your brand exactly, and how are these paints supposed to be used? These might be perfectly fine for someone else, but unfortunately they weren't for me. So maybe what's missing is a little bit of understanding. Maybe you could upload some videos talking about how to use your paints, grab a miniature and show how to use them on a miniature, which I think would be really useful. Really what I'm struggling with is information on how to use them. I did try and look for some things myself. Usually that doesn't mean I'm going to do it right. So I'd just love to know a little bit more about how to actually use these paints, how to thin them down, how to thicken them up. Can I use them as washes? Do I add any type of mediums to that. Should these paints be used for base coating? Should you mix them with other paints, for example? All those kind of things would be really much appreciated. And thirdly, and finally, I just want to reiterate that I do think that using your time to formulate these paints, whether it's like paid or unpaid, it's a really cool thing. And, you know, obviously not a lot of people are working on this type of thing. You're not a big corporation with loads of money, you know, you're doing this pretty much on your own, and I think that's incredible. I do really appreciate that. It certainly sparked a lot of curiosity in me as well. I did learn a lot, and I'm still going to continue to use these paints, and I'm sure I'm going to find more and more ways to use them. These two sets have a great mix of hues that I've not seen anywhere else, and I can see the thought that was put into everything. And like I said before, it would be really lovely to just know a little bit more about what you're doing with these paints specifically, and who knows, maybe have a chat sometime. Hopefully I'll see you in the comments. If not, that's fine. Ultimately, I just wanted to say keep going, and I really think that the next batch is going to be even better. So I will leave any relevant links to Mr. Pigments in the description, and I hope you liked this video. If you did, give it a like. If you want to see me review any more paints in the future, I actually have something coming up quite soon. I'm Mars, this is Roll for Paint, and I'll see you in the next one. Don't tell anyone, but I actually found a better use for the carboxymethyl cellulose. You're not gonna believe it. Subscribe!